I still remember the sound of the door closing like it was a gunshot, the kind of sound that echoes in your chest, bouncing off your ribs, leaving a hollow emptiness behind. I was 15 years old. My parents had just left for Europe, not for a weekend, not for a week, for an entire month. And the only thing they left me with was $100. At that moment, I realized something terrifying. The people who are supposed to protect you the most, the people who promised to care for you, could abandon you in a single, thoughtless decision. I learned that day that love without action is meaningless, that safety can vanish in a heartbeat, and that a mistake, even a small one, can echo for years. My mother was the first to check the passport again. I don't know why she did it. Maybe she was nervous, maybe she was afraid she might forget it somewhere. My father was already talking about the cities, the museums, the food, the wine, the excitement dripping from his voice like sunlight. They were excited, but somehow none of it touched me. It was like watching a movie where you're in the scene but invisible. I stood there barely moving, watching them pack and talk and laugh. I felt a strange mix of anger and disbelief and fear, but mostly disbelief. How could they just leave? How could they not even notice the way I was standing there, staring at their movements? How could they laugh when they knew I was staying behind with $100 to last me 30 days? The house smelled of coffee and perfume and something else I can't describe. Maybe the smell of normal life leaving me behind. Their suitcases were neatly lined up in the hallway, silent markers of departure, of abandonment. My mother glanced at the clock again. My father tapped his foot, and I realized no one was thinking of me. Then my mother stopped, reached into her bag, and placed something on the kitchen counter. $100. It landed softly, almost unnoticeably, but the sound still echoed. Too soft for the weight of responsibility, too light for the role it was supposed to fill. I remember picking it up, turning it over in my hands, imagining somehow it might multiply, imagining somehow it might become food, bills, safety, but it didn't. My mother leaned down and kissed my forehead, a rushed, distracted gesture. "Be good," she said. My father smiled, "Don't burn the house down," and laughed. And then they left. The door closed. The sound was permanent. It echoed in the empty house, bouncing off the walls, embedding itself into my chest. I felt small, invisible, abandoned. I sat down at the table and stared at the money. 30 days, $100, $3.33 per day. Food alone cost more than that. Every day cost more than that. Life in general cost more than that. I called my mother. No answer. I called again, straight to voicemail. I typed a message. "Mom, what about groceries?" Seen. No reply. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that this wasn't abandonment, that they'd call, that they'd send more money, that this was just a temporary inconvenience. But deep down, I knew something fundamental had shifted. My safety net was gone. My world had been ripped open, leaving me alone to navigate it for 30 days. The first few days, I lived in denial. I ate instant noodles, bread, cereal with water when the milk ran out. I turned off lights, unplugged appliances, and walked to school to save bus money. At school, my stomach growled loudly during first period. A boy near me laughed. "Didn't you eat breakfast?" he asked. I smiled automatically and said, "Not hungry." Lying became instinct. Nighttime was the worst. By day 6, the money was almost gone. I would sit in the dark, counting coins, rationing water, trying to figure out how I could make it last. My phone battery was my lifeline, but every time I called, voicemail answered. 4%, 3%. I whispered to the darkness, "I'm scared." No one answered. By the second week, denial had vanished. Fear replaced it. Hunger became sharp, gnawing at me in ways I had never imagined. Every sound in the house made my chest tighten. The refrigerator humming, the wind outside, even the creak of the floorboards as I walked. I learned that fear can be constant, that it doesn't fade in the dark, that it grows every day you're left alone. I began rationing food with a meticulousness I had never known. Every bite was calculated, every sip of water measured. I made tiny lists in my head, imagining which days I could skip a meal entirely and which days I could stretch a slice of bread over 2 meals. The absurdity of living like this as a 15-year-old did not escape me, but survival doesn't leave room for despair for too long. It only leaves room for strategy. School became a battlefield. I tried to appear normal. I smiled, laughed, answered questions, pretended that everything was fine. But my stomach growled constantly. My eyes were tired, and my mind was occupied with the math of survival: coins, meals, time, and energy. I began thinking about my parents constantly, not with nostalgia, not with longing, but with anger, disbelief, and a quiet determination that something had to change. How could they leave me like this? How could they not even notice? And if this was a small mistake, what else might I be forced to survive alone? Every night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening, calculating, worrying, planning, counting the hours until the door would open, counting the days until I could see them again, knowing that nothing would feel the same, knowing that trust, once broken, never fully repairs itself. By the third week, I had adapted in ways that scared me. I could ration food without thinking. I could anticipate when my body would demand water or energy. I knew exactly how much I could spend and exactly when I could skip a meal. I walked to the grocery store calculating my steps, my energy expenditure, and the exact cost of every item. I had become a survival machine, and I hated every second of it. Yet in this new reality, I also began to feel something I didn't recognize at first: independence, power. I could make choices that determined life or hunger. I could survive, not with their help, not with anyone's help, but I could survive. And survival, I realized, was only the beginning. 31 days later, the door opened. My parents returned. Laughter, stories of museums, wine, food, memories they had created, memories I had missed. "You survived," my mother said. "So, nothing burned down?" my father added. They did not notice how thin I had become. They did not notice the empty fridge. They did not notice how I had grown up in 31 days. They did not notice that something inside me had changed permanently. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and made a promise. I would never depend on them again. Not emotionally, not financially, not ever. And that promise became a seed. A seed that years later would grow into something much stronger. By the second week, the initial shock had faded, replaced by a cold, quiet clarity. I understood, with brutal precision, that I could not rely on anyone, not on my parents, not on friends, not on strangers. Survival would depend entirely on me and me alone. I began waking up before the sun, long before my school alarm. Every morning I planned my day down to the minute: when to eat, when to walk, when to work, when to rest. I measured everything, every movement, every bite of food, every drop of water. My body became a calculator. My mind became a ledger. I started with small errands. I walked door to door in our neighborhood, offering help wherever I could find it. "Do you need help cleaning?" I would ask, trying not to sound desperate. "Do you need someone to babysit?" Sometimes doors slammed in my face. Sometimes people looked at me as if I were lying, or worse, invisible. One elderly woman finally said yes. She let me clean her house for 2 hours. I scrubbed floors, dusted shelves, washed windows, and cleaned bathrooms until my hands stung and my nails were raw. She handed me $20. I thanked her quietly, my voice small, like I had no right to sound grateful. Then I locked myself in her bathroom and cried. Not because I needed the money, but because someone had noticed me. Someone had seen me as a person and not just a shadow of neglect. After that, jobs began to follow. Babysitting for a neighbor's kids, washing dishes at a small cafe, delivering groceries for people who were too busy to walk. Every day I walked home exhausted, my stomach still growling, my hands raw from work. And every day I rationed the meager food I had managed to buy. School became another battlefield. I had to appear normal, smile, answer questions, hide the gnawing hunger in my stomach, hide the exhaustion in my eyes. Some days I felt faint in class. My teachers asked if I was sick. I lied. "I'm fine," I said, and I meant it because admitting the truth would be worse. Every day, my parents posted photos online. They were smiling in Paris, in Venice, in Rome, holding wine glasses, laughing in cafes. I wanted to scream at the screen, to shatter the phone, to make them understand what I had lived through. But I didn't. Anger simmered silently. It became a quiet, growing thing in my chest. By the third week, my body had adjusted to hunger, but my mind was sharper than ever. I planned meals down to the calorie. I counted every bite. I measured every sip of water. I became a master of survival because survival was no longer optional. It was the only thing keeping me alive. And yet, with survival came something unexpected: independence, power. I could make choices that determined life or starvation. I could make myself endure pain. I could calculate the world and bend it to the edges of my will. I had no one to help me, and that was terrifying and empowering at the same time. The nights were the worst. I lay in bed, cold, exhausted, stomach empty, body aching, listening to the house groan and sigh, the wind outside, the occasional creak of a floorboard. Fear would grip me. Every sound was a possible threat. I imagined everything that could happen, and my mind rehearsed every scenario. What if the pipes burst? What if there was a fire? What if I passed out from hunger? But I did not break. By the time the fourth week arrived, I had learned to survive in silence. I could walk past adults without being noticed. I could stretch food for days. I could work harder than anyone else, and I did it without complaint, without expectation, without acknowledgement. One morning, I realized I was no longer the frightened girl in the kitchen when my parents left. I was calculating, precise, focused. I had become someone who could survive on their own. I had grown stronger than my parents had anticipated, and stronger than they would ever imagine. And with that strength came something else: understanding. Anger, yes. Resentment, yes, but also clarity. I realized that the people who abandoned me had a weakness. They had left me alive, but had underestimated me. They had left me with hunger and fear and no supervision, and in doing so had given me something they would never regain: independence, resourcefulness, and the raw edge of control. School became easier in some ways, harder in others. I knew how to hide my pain. I knew how to make people believe I was fine. I made friends quietly, carefully, not because I needed them, but because I needed a cover. I learned how to blend, how to observe, how to analyze. Every human interaction became a study in power, subtlety, and survival. By the time my parents returned, 31 days later, I was not the same girl who had been abandoned. I had changed. My body was thinner. My face was sharper. My mind was calculating. My heart carried a quiet fury that I did not yet fully understand. They came back laughing, talking about their experiences. My mother said, "You survived." My father laughed, "So nothing burned down?" They did not see me. They did not see the years of survival that had passed in that single month. They did not see the girl who had learned fear, hunger, pain, and endurance, all while pretending to be fine. They did not see the person who had learned to grow, to adapt, to endure. And I made a silent promise. I would never depend on them again. Not financially, not emotionally, not for protection. And I would make them understand one day that abandonment leaves marks that never fully heal. The years that followed were shaped by that promise. I worked harder than anyone else. I studied finance. I studied law. I studied business. I learned how money works, how power works, how to create systems that would never leave me dependent. I used my fear as fuel. I used my anger as motivation. By my late 20s, I had built a life that my parents could never have imagined. I had control. I had independence. I had the kind of power that comes from surviving when no one believed you could. And yet, I waited. I waited for the moment when the lesson would come full circle. Because survival was only the beginning. The next step was learning how to turn survival into power. And power, I knew, was the seed of revenge. Life has a strange way of balancing itself. Sometimes justice does not arrive immediately. Sometimes the people who hurt you continue, oblivious to the pain they caused. And sometimes it arrives in your hands years later when you are finally strong enough to matter. By the time my parents called me again, I was 32 years old. I had built a life that was entirely my own. I had worked through college, through fear, through endless nights of anxiety and hunger to create stability. Money, influence, and knowledge were my tools now. I was no longer a frightened 15-year-old girl left alone with only $100. I was someone who could observe, calculate, and act, and they had no idea. The call came unexpectedly. My mother's voice trembled on the other end. We just need temporary help, she said, words soft, unsure. Her tone was different from the dismissive laughter I remembered. There was fear in her voice, an echo of recognition that perhaps she had underestimated the girl she once abandoned. I didn't respond immediately. I listened to the tremble in her voice, the hesitation. I let the silence stretch. I let her wait. It was time for them to understand what it felt like to be powerless, to feel the weight of dependency and fear, even for a moment. I agreed to meet them. An expensive restaurant was chosen, somewhere quiet, away from prying eyes. The white tablecloths, the soft music, the delicate clinking of glasses, everything was a stage, and I was the one holding the spotlight. They walked in older, smaller, less confident than I remembered. Their suits were crisp, but their faces showed signs of strain, financial strain, worry, age, and fear. Relief and hope were evident in their eyes when they saw me. Perhaps they thought that the child they abandoned would still be helpless, willing to fix their mistakes with nothing in return. I slid a folder across the table. "I can help," I said calmly, quietly. Not a trace of the 15-year-old fear remained in my voice. They looked at the folder, at me, and hope flickered brighter. They did not yet understand. "But there are conditions," I continued. "Conditions you must follow precisely if you wish to receive anything." Their eyes widened. My mother swallowed nervously. My father's hand twitched slightly. They had no idea what I had prepared. They had no idea how deliberate I had been. They had no idea that I remembered every detail of the month they had abandoned me. I began to outline the rules. Nothing was optional. Nothing could be circumvented. Their lives had been chaotic, unmanaged, filled with indulgence and carelessness, and now every action they took would be measured, restricted, and deliberate. I reminded them of the $100, of the unanswered calls, of the month I had spent alone, hungry, terrified, calculating every step to survive. I described the nights I had spent awake, listening to the creaks of the house, imagining fires, imagining illness, imagining injury, and knowing that no one was coming to help me. I slid the first prepaid card across the table, $100. That would be their allowance each month. No extras, no emergencies, no deviations. I watched their faces change. First disbelief, then fear, then desperation. I could see the wheels turning in their minds, trying to calculate how I could enforce such control, how I could be so merciless. "You wouldn't," my father whispered, voice breaking. "You wouldn't do this to us." "I already did," I said softly. It was not cruelty. It was justice. It was the natural consequence of neglect. I did not destroy them. I educated them. I taught them a lesson they had ignored for decades, that every action, every neglectful choice has a cost, that the people they had abandoned were not powerless forever, that the child they dismissed had grown into someone strong enough to demand accountability. The lunch continued in silence. The restaurant seemed louder, more observant than usual. Every clink of cutlery, every whisper from nearby tables seemed magnified. I sat back, calm, watching them squirm under the weight of their own past mistakes. I could see the regret begin to form. I could see the realization that they had underestimated me, that for a month they had thought leaving me alone was inconsequential, that leaving me with only $100, ignoring my calls, assuming I would be fine, was justifiable. It wasn't. And now it never would be. Weeks passed, months passed. They complied. They learned the limits I had set. Every transaction, every purchase, every interaction had to follow my rules. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The child they had once abandoned now dictated the terms of their survival. Over time, my mother began to apologize. Not a shallow, convenient apology. Not words meant to ease her conscience, but real apologies, whispered in moments of honesty and humility. She admitted she had been careless, thoughtless, and dismissive. She admitted that her priorities had been skewed, and that she had failed in the most fundamental way a parent could fail. My father never apologized fully, but I could see the change in him. The arrogance, the casual humor, the assumptions, all gone, replaced by careful calculation, respect, and the knowledge that he had once abandoned someone he should have protected. And I forgave them, not for them, but for me. Not because they deserved it, but because holding on to that rage, letting it consume me, would have continued the cycle. Forgiveness, carefully measured, became another form of control. It became my way of reclaiming power fully, not through destruction, but through transformation. I no longer feared being abandoned. I no longer doubted my ability to survive. I no longer doubted my capacity to grow, to build, to enforce consequences for those who had wronged me. And most importantly, I no longer allowed anyone to hold power over me simply by virtue of being a parent. Neglect is a form of abuse, and abandonment leaves marks that last a lifetime. Survival leaves strength, anger leaves focus, fear leaves discipline, and patience leaves opportunity. Time collects its debt, and sometimes that debt arrives not in violence, not in confrontation, but in quiet, deliberate, unshakable control.
I had been given $100 and 31 days of fear, and I turned it into a lifetime of power.